I must begin this talk with some etymology. This early 16th century couple, recently tentatively identified as Nicholas College, a former mayor of Norwich, who died in 1502, and his wife, commemorated at St Andrew, Norwich, by an N3 Norwich brass from the workshop of William Hayward, are shown with what we would call nowadays rosaries. However, in 1502, they would have been puzzled by the term rosary. They might have been familiar with a devotional text entitled the Rosarium Beate Mariae Virginis, the Rose Garden of the Blessed Virgin Mary, but they would have called the device used for their devotions a pair of beads. The Latin equivalent in wheels and inventories is par precum. Bead, which comes from the Old English bidden, to pray, was first used specifically for the object used to count prayers, and only later, by extension, was applied to any small perforated body, spherical or otherwise, used as an ornament, to quote the Oxford English Dictionary. In the 13th and 14th centuries, the more usual term in both English and Anglo-Norman was paternoster, which was later used specifically for the larger beads, also called gauds by the 1370s. The term rosary is not used in English to describe prayer beads until well into the 16th century. However, for the sake of simplicity, I shall use the term rosary in this talk. I shall concentrate on the English evidence, but will occasionally refer to continental material to illustrate specific points. The story of the Rosary begins with the early hermits and monks of the Egyptian desert, who attempted to follow St. Paul's injunction to pray without ceasing, either by saying all 150 psalms of the Psalter, or by repeated recital of a set prayer, such as the Jesus Prayer. It was soon found necessary to devise some way of reckoning the number of prayers. In the Vitae Patrum, we are told of Paul of Ferme, who counted his prayers by removing 300 pebbles which he had placed in his lap. A more convenient method was to tell off the prayers on a knotted cord. Prayer ropes of this type, usually with beads at intervals, are still used by Eastern Orthodox religious. A variant is the leather listovka with its symbolic steps in use amongst the Russian old ritualists. It is worth noting in passing that the use of prayer beads is not confined to Christian traditions, but is found in Eastern Asia from the 4th century AD, most notably in Buddhist worship. In 2021, during excavation of the Anglo-Saxon monastery at Lindisfarne, a necklace made of salmon vertebrae was found in the grave, dated to the 8th or 9th century, of an adult male, presumably one of the monks. It has been suggested that this represents an early form of prayer beads. The earliest English person recorded as using beads as a prayer device is Godgifu, wife of Leofrich, Earl of Mercia, more commonly known as Lady Godiva, who probably died in 1067. According to William of Malmesbury, in his Gesta Pontificum Anglorum, she bequeathed to the Benedictine priory at Coventry, which she had founded together with her husband, a circlet of gems that she had threaded on a string, so that by touching each one in turn as she prayed, she might not omit any of the number, with the request that it be hung around the neck of a statue of the Blessed Virgin Mary. The careful way in which William of Malmesbury describes her use of this rosary suggests that he did not expect his readers to be familiar with this method of prayer. It is not known what prayers Lady Godiva said when using her beads. As the name Paternoster for a set of beads indicates, the Our Father was the prayer first associated with this method of prayer in Western Europe. The Rule of the Templars, drawn up under Cistercian influence in 1129, contains careful instructions about the number of prayers to be said. And when you hear matins rung, you should get up if there's a priest and hear them. And if there is no priest, you should say 26 paternosters, 13 for Our Lady and 13 for the day. And then you should say 30 paternosters for the dead and 30 for the living before you drink or eat. It is an incised slab commemorating the Templar commander Gérard de Villers, who died in 1273, which has what would appear to be the first representation of a rosary on a monument. From the fingers of his left hand, with which he holds the cord of his mantle, hangs a chaplet. A similar use of prayer beads can be documented for members of other military orders. Hospitallers are often depicted holding rosaries, as in these miniatures from 14th century Italy and late 15th century France. From the late 12th or early 13th century, the custom arose of saying the Psalter of Our Lady, consisting of 150 Aves. Sidney Sussex Manuscript 95, an enormous collection of Marian miracles compiled at Thorney Abbey, includes accounts of a monk of Saint Gilles in Provence, to whom this method of prayer was revealed, and of a religious of unstated order, whom Our Lady instructed to say 3 sets of 50 Aves in honour of the Annunciation, the Nativity, and the Assumption. Whatever the truth of these stories, we are on firmer ground in 13th century Flanders, which provides the earliest clear evidence of the role of the Dominicans in the promotion of rosary devotions. When Countess Joanna of Constantinople founded a convent of Béguines in Ghent, she entrusted their spiritual direction to the Dominicans. In the rule which they drew up in 1242, novices were required to say daily the Psalter of Our Lady, consisting of 3 chaplets, or hudikins, of 50 Aves. Similarly, the mystic Margaret of Ypres, who died in 1237, under the direction of the Dominican friar Zecher, recited 3 groups of 50 Aves. Other examples have been noted of early Dominican use of the Ave. Romeo de Livia, a Catalan Dominican who received the habit from St. Dominic himself in 1217 and was provincial of the province of Toulouse in the 1230s, is recorded to have said the Ave 1,000 times a day, using a knotted cord to count the number. Like many other devotions in medieval Europe, the rosary spread from religious orders to a wider lay audience. Its portability made it an ideal vehicle for devout laity, often of limited literacy, providing a basic structure for meditation. By the 15th century, the rosary had normalized as a number of decades of Aves, interspersed with paternosters and concluding with the Apostles' Creed. An important point to remember, especially if you're reconstructing medieval recipes, which give timings as a number of Aves, is that in pre-Reformation England, the Hail Mary comprised the initial angelic salutation. It was not until the 16th century that the second half of the prayer came into use, one of the earliest instances being Savonarola's Esposizione sopra l'Ave Maria, of 1495. The manufacture of rosaries was a skilled craft, depicted in one of the remarkable series of miniatures of various tradesmen in the Nuremberg Hausbuch of circa 1425. Rosary makers were working in London by the second half of the 13th century. A Robert Ornell Paternoster is recorded in 1276. The Paternosters were concentrated in the street called Paternoster Row, just to the north of St Paul's Cathedral, which was to become one of the main centres of the London book trade. By the beginning of the 16th century, nearby streets had acquired the names of Ave Maria Lane and Creed Lane. Streets called Paternoster Row can be found elsewhere in England. Their location near cathedrals supports the idea that they originated as places where rosaries were manufactured and sold. In a series of dialogues in French and English published by Caxton circa 1483, a paternoster maker is one of the characters introduced. Walter, the paternoster maker, sold at the dedication beads of crystal by dozens in jet, of amber, of glass, and of horn. The will of John Barrett of Bury St Edmunds gives some idea of the wide range of materials that could be used for rosaries: white amber, jet, silver, crystal, chalcedony. 21 pairs of beads already in his possession are mentioned, as well as rosaries to be supplied to mourners. One was bequeathed to Jenkins Smith, the most prominent Bury merchant after Barrett, whose brass is in St Mary's, Bury, not far from Barrett's tomb. The grooms and pages in Barrett's employ were to receive rosaries made of mistletoe wood. The stock of a London jeweller in 1381 included 5 paternosters of white bone for children, valued at 1 shilling each. Rosaries made of humble materials rarely feature in wills or inventories. Furthermore, under normal circumstances, rosaries made of organic materials, such as wood and bone, would not survive. When the Mary Rose sank in the Solent in 1545, among the artefacts that were preserved in the mud were no fewer than 10 rosaries, including this one made of boxwood. Aristocratic owners typically owned precious metal rosaries made by goldsmiths rather than paternosters. The inventory taken at the time of Richard II's deposition in 1399 gives details of 9 rosaries, several stated to be presents. An example is a gold paire de paternostres of 7 gourds, worked with 2 children on each gourd, each one garnished with 4 pearls, and the knop garnished with 48 pearls. This had been given by the Earl of Salisbury. Another, given by the Abbot of Westminster, had beads in the form of cockle shells. Jenny Stratford, who produced a marvellous edition of the Richard II inventory, has suggested that these were intended to evoke the idea of a spiritual pilgrimage. Another item in the Richard II inventory was a novelty belt made in the form of a paternoster. A unique survival of the precious metal rosaries recorded in inventories and wills is the Langdale Rosary, shown on the screen now in the Victoria and Albert Museum, made of gold and enamelled in black, probably dating from the 1490s. In its present state, it consists of 50 oval Ave beads with saints on each side, 6 larger paternoster beads with scenes from the life of Christ and his mother, and a knop depicting the adoration of the Magi. The owner could presumably use it as a form of litany of the saints, as well as a conventional rosary. The earliest occurrence of a rosary on an English monument is on the effigy of Blanche Mortimer, the wife of Sir Peter de Grandison, who died in 1347 and was buried in Much-Marcle Church, Herefordshire. The chaplet of beads terminates in a pendant of distinctive form. The inclusion of a rosary is, to the best of my knowledge, without parallel in 14th century English sculptured effigies, and is a manifestation of the singularity of this commission. That the rosary had entered everyday life by the late 1330s is confirmed by its appearance in the Luttrell Psalter in the hands of a traveller. The portability of the rosary made it the ideal accompaniment for a journey. The most famous rosary in medieval literature is that carried by the prioress in Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. Her depiction in the Ellesmere Chaucer, dating from the first decade of the 15th century, exactly mirrors the text of the prologue. Of small coral about her arm she bar, a pair of beads, gilded all with green, and thereon hang a brooch of gold full sheen, on which there was first write a crowned R, and after amor vincit omnia. Slightly earlier in date are the 2 men carrying chaplet rosaries in the procession at the consecration of a church in the Carmelite Missal, illuminated in London. In the memorial portrait of Chaucer that Hoccleve had included in his Regiment of Princes, the poet is shown holding a pair of jet beads threaded on a red cord. This can be seen as emphasizing his mature years. In the scenes of the Ages of Man on the brass of Peter Lensem at Ypres, the mature man puts aside the folly of his youth and goes to church holding his rosary. Chaucer's rosary is also intended as a reminder to the viewer to pray for the soul of the deceased poet. The rosary, as an emblem of prayer, is to be found in the depiction of Sloth by Bosch in the Prado tabletop, where the sluggard ignores the beads proffered by his wife, who is ready for church. The rosary became a standard emblem of a hermit, an iconographic identifier, as exemplified by this drawing in the margin of an early 15th century early 15th century missal, oral manuscript 75, recently discovered by Linda Dennison, and the frontispiece to the Winkinder Word 1506 edition of Richard Roller's Contemplations of the Dread and Love of God. Gifts of rosaries in wills were intended as reminders to pray for the soul of the deceased. Typical is the bequest of Joan Elvedon, widow of Muchelney, Somerset, in her will made on the 4th of September 1421, of a pair of jet prayer beads to the Dominican artist John Syphawas. The efficacy of the rosary is the theme of a particularly charming iconography of the particular judgment, which first occurs in the 3rd quarter of the 14th century, if my dating of a much faded wall painting at Lenham in Kent is correct. It is found in a variety of media from the 14th to the 16th century. As St. Michael weighs the good and bad deeds of the deceased, cheating devils pull down the scale containing the sins, but are countered by the Virgin, who casts a rosary onto the balance beam. In the Pembroke College alabaster, an early 15th century work, she is shown as a Schutzen Madonna, protecting the soul in her mantle. A common provision of chantry foundations was that beadsmen, usually infirm or elderly, should pray for the deceased. Typical is the clause in Henry V's will. Item, we wish that for a full year to be counted from the day of our burial, 30 paupers, who should be very needy men, should be presented with sufficient food and clothing, each of whom should every day say the Psalter of the Blessed Virgin for our soul, adding at the end, in his vernacular, Mary, Mother of God, remember your servant Henry, who puts all his hope in you. Beadsmen can be found on sculptured tombs, usually among the weepers on the tomb chest. But some alabaster tombs in the years around 1500 feature the conceit of a somnolent beadsman as a foot support. Rosaries first occur on an English brass in the hands of crippled beadsmen at the foot of a lady in St. Stephen, Norwich. Who this brass originally commemorated is unknown. The style suggests that it was an early product of the London Dee workshop of circa 1405 to 10. In 1546 it was recycled by means of providing a new inscription, engraved in the N6 Norwich workshop for Eel or Elizabeth Buttrey, late prioress of Campsie Ash in Suffolk. It is likely that the brass, like the prioress, had been ejected from a dissolved East Anglian religious foundation. It has been suggested that the beadsmen are part of the adaptation of the brass in 1546, but stylistically their faces belong to the early 15th century. They are not unlike the cripples in the miniature of St. Etheldreda in the Cornwall Hours, illuminated in London in the 1410s. It is probable that many, I might even venture to say most, of those commemorated by medieval English brasses possessed at least one rosary. For example, Eleanor de Bohun, Duchess of Gloucester, bequeathed a pair of paternosters of coral to her mother Joan, Countess of Hereford. However, it is not until the late 1460s that rosaries become a regular feature of English monumental brasses. The motif is first employed by the London Dee workshop, is soon picked up by the London F workshop, and then enters the design repertoire of engravers in Bury, Norwich, Cambridge, and Coventry. Men are shown with a simple strand, sometimes with a ring at one end, and often folded over the belt, and women with a chaplet. Pre-Reformation English rosaries are not depicted with a pendant cross or crucifix, but end with what John Barrett refers to as a knop, otherwise called a tuft. Pre-Civil War drawing of two brasses at Peterborough Cathedral shows terminal crosses, but I suspect this is a case of the artist drawing what he thought ought to be there. Early 16th century women usually have the rosary hanging from a girdle, as on this detail of the brass of Margaret Munford, died 1520, at Feltwell St Mary in Norfolk, and the unfortunately damaged figure of Elizabeth Pierpoint, died 1543, at West Malling in Kent, possibly the latest pre-Reformation example. With one exception to be discussed shortly, depictions of rosaries are confined to lay civilian brasses of people up to gentry status but no higher. Men in official robes are not usually shown with a rosary, but one can be glimpsed on the brass of Sir Thomas Urswick, Recorder of London and Chief Baron of the Exchequer. What is the explanation of this emergence of rosaries on brasses? It happens too early to posit a connection with the rosary confraternities, founded as a result of the preaching of Alanus de Rupe. They first appear in the 1470s in Flanders and then spread outwards to other countries. The most likely explanation is the existence of a now lost brass in one of the big London churches, which must have served as marblers' showrooms. What began as a special commission was admired and emulated, and so the rosary-holding figure was added to the stock of patterns in the various workshops. It is possible, moreover, that the appearance of the rosary on brasses reflects a change in fashion from carrying to wearing rosaries, facilitated by the belts and girdles of 15th century costume. In the brasses we have seen so far, the rosary is held as a token of prayer. At Fovant in Wiltshire, the brass commemorating George Reed, rector at the time of the building of the new tower in 1492, shows the act of praying the rosary. The rector, in cassock with hood, contemplates the Annunciation. As I mentioned earlier, the larger beads of the rosary were called gauds by the 1370s at the latest. The compiler of the Oxford English Dictionary entry is puzzled as to the origin of the word. It would seem to me that it derives from devotions to the joys of the Virgin, sometimes 7, as here in the Hours of Elizabeth the Queen, sometimes 5 and sometimes 15. Prayers on this theme often consist of clauses beginning Gaude, rejoice. George Reed addresses Mary as Blessed Mother of Pity, which hints at another devotion, the 7 Sorrows of Mary, often grouped around an image of the Pietà. In the Arnolfini wedding, Jan van Eyck shows a crystal rosary hanging on a nail, and next to it a mirror. Most of those looking at the picture concentrate on the scene in the mirror and ignore the 10 roundels in the mirror frame with the scenes of the Passion, from the agony in the garden to the resurrection, subjects on which the owner of the rosary would have meditated. The 15th century saw the development of a variety of meditations and methods of reciting the rosary, circulated first in manuscript and then in print. A popular one was the Rosary of the Carthusian Dominic of Prussia, consisting of 50 meditations on the life of Christ, seen here in a copy written for a priest living in or near Bury St Edmunds in the 1480s. A member of a Venetian ambassadorial party provides an account of English life circa 1500, which, though full of rosary generalizations, indicates the place of the rosary in communal lay devotions. Although they all attend Mass every day and say many paternosters in public, the women carrying long rosaries in their hands, and any who can read taking the office of Our Lady with them, and with some companion reciting it in the church verse by verse, in a low voice after the manner of churchmen. They always hear Mass on Sunday in their parish church. That the rosary's primary role was as an instrument in domestic piety is illustrated by a unique glimpse of a household in Chelsea in the 1520s. In Holbein's preparatory drawing for his now lost painting of the Moore family, they are shown at prayer. Although gathered together, they are captured in individual aspects of devotion. Some are reading from prayer books, while Margaret Roper seems to be meditating on the text she has just read. To her left, her younger sister, Cecily Heron, having read a passage, is fingering her beads in prayer. To the left, Elizabeth Dauncey, Sir Thomas More's second daughter, has yet to begin praying. The long strand of her rosary hangs from a sash-like girdle, and her prayer book is tucked under her arm. A Flemish brass at Ipswich, formerly in St Mary at Key Church, and now in Christ Church Mansion, appears to belong to this ordered world of late medieval devotion. It depicts Thomas Pounder, a merchant who made his fortune in the risky Iceland trade, his wife Emma, and their children. Emma and her eldest daughter Joan, already married to Thomas Barber, are shown wearing rosaries. When Thomas Pounder died in 1525, he made generous bequests to his parish church and the 3 Ipswich friaries. But Ipswich, on the east coast, was open to the import of novel religious ideas. As John Blatchley and Peter Northeast revealed, Emma and Joan became convinced Protestants. They moved to the parish of St Clement, which seems to have had a reputation for radicalism. In the reign of Queen Mary, they were among parishioners presented for refusing to behold the elevation of the sacrament. When Emma died, 39 years after her husband, she was buried in the churchyard of St Clement, rather than under her husband's popish monument. After Henry VIII's death in 1547, several rosaries were recorded lying around his various palaces. These were useless lumber and worse in the eyes of the new politico-religious regime. In 1549, the year of the introduction of the first English prayer book, Cranmer launched an attack on traditional forms of private devotion, ordering his clergy to remove imagery from parishioners' houses and forbidding the saying of the rosary by the laity. At Whitsun, Walter Raleigh the Elder encountered an old lady on her way to church at Clist St Mary in Devon, carrying her beads, and threatened her with punishment. This incident was one of the sparks to the Prayer Book Rebellion, which for Clist St Mary ended with the massacre of villagers and the torching of the village. Now I have a problem because a page of my paper has failed to print. So I'll just briefly mention that there's a revival of the Rosary, obviously under Queen Mary, and new forms of devotion are printed, both in the English and more commonly in the vernacular. And then with the advent of the Elizabethan regime, we have persecution again. And so the war against the Rosary began again. In 1569, Archbishop Parker submitted a report on the Diocese of Chichester, which was notoriously resistant to the Reformation. In some places, because the rood was taken away, they painted in that place a cross with chalk. And because that was washed away with painting, and the number of crosses standing at graves in the churchyard taken also away, they have since made crosses on the church walls within and without, and upon the pulpit and communion table, in despite of the preacher. Some old folks and women used to have beads in the churches, but these I took away from them, but they have some yet at home in their houses. At a time when access to the sacraments was difficult, blessed objects, sacramentals, such as rosaries, played an enhanced role in the devotional life of recusants. Some had inherited rosaries they could use. The Langdale rosary survived because it came into the hands of a Catholic nobleman, Lord William Howard. Others made their own or relied on the services of undercover peddlers, such as the Irishman arrested at Euston in Suffolk in 1639 on suspicion of begging, who was found to be carrying 31 rosaries and 5 copies of the Office of the Virgin. Law officers often searched for rosaries as evidence that a suspect was a practicing Catholic. The anti-Catholic penal legislation of 1571 made it an offence to bring into England or receive crucifixes, beads, or other objects blessed by the Pope or anyone holding faculties from him. It is in this context that one must view the brass commemorating Roland Eyre of Hassop and his wife Gertrude, who both died in 1624 in the Derbyshire village of Great Longston. They are depicted kneeling at prie-dieu, a common arrangement in early 17th century monuments. But between them is a crucifix, which might be found on Catholic and Lutheran monuments of the early 17th century, but would be quite foreign to the aniconic Calvinism of contemporary Anglicanism. The crucifix and a clause at the end of the inscription requesting prayers for the souls of the deceased were subsequently defaced, most probably in the 1640s. But the iconoclast overlooked the rosaries held by Roland and Gertrude. In the 17th and 18th centuries, rosaries are a stock feature of anti-Catholic imagery. On the title page of Robert Burton's Anatomy of Melancholy, first published in 1621, Superstitiosus is depicted as a kneeling Franciscan clutching his beads. In 1829, while the Duke of Wellington was steering through Parliament the Catholic Relief Bill, which was to allow Catholics to re-enter political life, he was accused by Lord Winchelsea of an insidious design for the infringement of our liberties. When Winchelsea refused to retract, he was challenged to a duel, which was fought in Battersea Fields. The cartoonist William Heath, in his version of this duel, shows Wellington as a lobster, a term referring to his army background. Soldiers were often called lobsters, in monkish robes, a rosary at his waist. Fortunately, the Prime Minister was unharmed. Winchelsea apologised, and the bill received the royal assent. The rosary reappeared on monuments. Rosaries are a common feature of brasses produced in the Harden workshop for Catholic clients. In the brass designed by Pugin at Sawston in Cambridgeshire, Mrs. Sarah Huddleston, who died in 1848, has her rosary looped over her left arm as she prays at her prie-dieu. My last example is Father Augustin Rook, who died in 1901, fingering the beads of his rosary on the Hardman brass commemorating him in the great Dominican Priory Church at Haverstock Hill in London, of which he was the first superior. The church, mostly designed by Charles Alban Butler, is notable for its sequence of 15 altars, each dedicated to a different mystery of the Rosary. As we have seen, there have been strong links between the Dominicans and the Rosary since the 13th century. It comes as something of a surprise, then, to learn from an excellent article by Father Augustine Thompson that the Rosary has only been an official part of the Dominican habit since 1924. However, the 1924 Constitution simply codified what had been universal custom in the order since the 17th century, at least. In a similar way, behind the late and somewhat fitful appearance of rosaries or monumental brasses lies a long and deep tradition of devotional experience. Thank you.